everybody. Thank you so much for coming to today's panel discussion. My name is Myrna. I work with Canvas Magazine, the premier magazine for art and culture from the Middle East and Arab world. Today's session is the closing chapter to Gender Wars and Chadors. It's a Canvas organized panel discussion that was born in Art Basel exactly a year ago. We're closing it with Hans, Ulrich Obrist, who doesn't need an introduction. Earlier this year, Hans Ulrich was voted the most important, influential person in the art world. I'd like to know, who do you think is the most important, influential person in the art world?
Yeah, I think that's really, really simple because it's always the artist. And I think, there would be no art world without artists. And my idea of the artist is a very artist-centered, view. So artists are the most important people, not only in the art world, but in the world.
Canvas created Gender Wars and Chadors to show, among other things, that Middle Eastern art is not confined to gender wars and chadors. What else do you find in Middle Eastern art?
Yeah, I think, these are definitely topics, which are relevant. I thought it was very nice that on your invitation card, you actually replaced an icon, right? It's now a microphone.
Yes.
And what was it before?
It used to be a rocket, a
the
fighter jet.
So the rocket, on the logo became a microphone. So we go very much what, Yoko Ono always says, that maybe, the art world is, a peace industry and not a war industry.
Hopefully.
But I think, to answer your question, I think one thing which is very relevant is that these are topics which are certainly present in artists in the Middle East. However, it would be very reductive to reduce artists to these topics because it's a, I think it's a danger of a cliché. And as Deleuze always said, art is often mostly a critique of clichés. And I think many of the artists, for this very reason, complexify the game. And there are many different aspects. I think, for example, it's very interesting how important memory is with many of these artists' practice. No memory, a protest against forgetting. One can see that in almost all the artists, I've come across. So that would be certainly a topic, to be added.
Let me ask you something. Another topic that keeps coming up in Middle Eastern art is censorship. Do you think it's such a big deal, given how prominent and successful Middle Eastern art and Chinese art have become on a global scale?
Yeah, I think it's very, particularly I find it always very difficult to say, there is censorship in this world and there is not censorship, in that world, because we have censorship, in most parts of the world, in different contexts. So I think there is a different type of censorship, happening in different geographies, in different places. One censorship, for example, which Doris Lessing always points out, the great Nobel Prize winning novelist whom I talked to recently about that whole topic of censorship, she said we should never forget the notion of self-censorship. For example, she as a novelist, it's not only the novels which are censored, but it's the novels she wouldn't write because she wouldn't dare to write them, right? So I think censorship is such a big topic, so self-censorship is an important part. And then I think, we definitely, need to wherever we are, to expand the field of art. As Leon Golubow always says, it's a gate of possibility, and censorship shuts these possibilities. So, it's our role to resist that and open the gates of possibilities.
Speaking of possibility, do you think you'll ever see a work by, for example, Gustave Courbet's The Origin of the World in a museum in the Gulf?
Yeah, I think it was the ex-German minister Genscher. He once said one should never say never, in politics. I think it's also true, for art. And I think it's particularly important to see the rapid change we can see now, in the world. And I think, most certainly, I think, curators should never be, futurists. I think it's about being as close as possible as we can to understand our present and, invent maybe the future out of fragments, from the past. And, Courbet is definitely such a fragment from the past which can help us to build the future.
A lot of the focus on Middle Eastern art is geared towards the artists. Not enough attention is being given to curators in the Middle East. How do you think we can enhance that?
Yeah, I think one of the things which is important is and we're going to speak, because it's funny, each time I pronounce the word Middle East, I think we need a neologism.
We're getting there.
And we're going to get there. So stay with us for the moment. For the moment, we call it the Middle East, or the notion formerly known as Middle East. I mean, one of the things which is interesting is definitely, the lack of curator schools, and that's something which is important. And I think, curating can appear in different, circumstances. There are obviously curator schools, that's one possibility, but it's also learning on the job. And I mean, for me, most of the things I've learned wasn't in curator school, because when I started, there weren't that many curator schools, so I learned it from my mentors, Caspar Koenig, Suzanne Paget, B.J. Kurigan, they were my great mentors from whom I learned how to do an exhibition. And so I think, that's one of the things which will be very important, internships. It's not only curator schools, but I mean, my way of teaching very often is, internships. I have interns who work with me all the time, and that's how I transmit. And I think, in the future, particularly also in the region of the Middle East, that sort of will be a very important part. And I think ideas of schools in general is very important, because I think, we need in a dynamic art world a lot of different aspects. I mean, there is obviously the necessity of museums, which now are being built. It's very important that there are collectors. In the center, as we know, there are artists. Without the artists, there is no art world. But then it's very, very important, besides the museums, the galleries, that there is also dynamic schools. So, it's a little bit the question of the Black Mountain College. And we, for the moment, don't really have a Black Mountain College, anywhere. It's kind of missing a transdisciplinary school of that type. And so, maybe that's one of the things which could happen,
I think you mentioned this in an earlier panel discussion. In the West, when an artist has been acquired by a major institution or by an extraordinary collector, that artist has made it, so to speak. What do you think qualifies a Middle Eastern artist making it in the region?
Yeah, I mean, art is really very much a marathon, and it's not something about, a couple of years. But if we look at the great artists, they work over 3, 4, 5 decades, 30, 40, 50 years. And in an extraordinary way, great artists over these many decades always produce new reality. And I think, from that point of view, it is a marathon and not a sprint. Now, there are obviously different, aspects, and I think one of the things which is particularly important is that there is more literature about, artists in the Middle East, because we obviously, there is a lot of auction catalogs, there is a lot of,
books.
There start to be biennales.
Magazines,
fairs. There's magazines, catalogs of fairs. You're absolutely right. These are very important, vectors. But what is very often missing is scholarship. It's missing important monographs, on artists, important, books on artists. And that's one of the things when I started to visit very regularly Dubai and also, and I must say, for me, it's early days, because research is very slow, and I've been so far 6, 7 times, I've been to Dubai, to Abu Dhabi, to Cairo, and there are many, many more trips now planned over the next 18 months, which we're going to do with Julia Peyton-Johns and the Serpentine, and that will then, be the fundament of this research. But in my early trips, what I've observed is that there are wonderful artists who just don't have yet monographic books. And that is one of the first things I started then to immediately do as a reaction. So we did these 2 books with Suzanne Hefuna, where we involved also a lot of authors and philosophers, like Al-Gitani or Al-Aswani. And yet at the same time, I'm working at the moment on a monograph of Monir.
Farmayan.
Exactly, who is the great pioneering artist in Iran, who has worked for more than 6 decades, and that will be a very big book gathering for the first time her influential practice. And then obviously another way is also the interviews. I mean, as part of my activity, there is always the interviews, and the interviews are kind of a protest against forgetting. So I remember when I went for the first time to Cairo, I rang Ali from Cairo airport, Ali Kadra, and I asked him, who is the pioneer, who is the Louis Bourgeois of Cairo? And Ali was saying, very urgent, you go to see Adam Hennein. So we went to see, and that is part of my methodology. The question, who is a pioneer in a specific context, and Etel Adnan would be another example.
What is your dream curatorial project in the Middle East?
I mean, we can say that I have, several unrealized projects, obviously, because as an architect, a curator has quite a lot of unrealized projects which don't materialize. But I've got one really main unrealized project which could happen anywhere, and that's really the project of a palace or a big structure of unrealized projects, because I've been archiving and researching unrealized artist projects ever since 1991, and somehow I always had this idea to do one day a big exhibition of artist projects which have been too big to be realized, too small to be realized, forgotten projects, coming back to censorship, censor projects, projects which have been self-censored, forgotten, discarded, and somehow these utopias, concrete utopias, to show them all in one exhibition, in one big exhibition, or to make them into one big museum of utopia is kind of my own utopia, so to say.
Is this what your imaginary museum is going to be comprised of?
Partially, yes. It would be one department in my imaginary museum, the department of unrealized projects. So obviously, I've been working in existing organizations. First of all, in the 90s, I was freelance curator. Then in 2000, I became curator of the Museum of Modern Art of the City of Paris. And now, since 2006, I co-direct the Serpentine Gallery with Julia Peyton-Jones. But parallel to this, I've always been thinking, how could a really resolutely transdisciplinary institution for the 21st century work? And that has been very inspired by Cedric Price and the Fan Palace. And so we can say, the Department of Unrealized Projects would be sort of one aspect of this Fan Palace, in which you would have all kinds of things. You would have laboratories, the idea of the laboratorium, for places for experiment. You'd have chapels where you would have a quiet, almost solipsistic experiment, experience with the artwork. You would have fast lanes and low lanes. I mean, I have lots of drawings about this, unrealized institution.
How much Middle Eastern art will you have inside your imaginary museum?
How much?
Middle Eastern art.
Yeah, I think what is important, and again, we need to question this category of the Middle East, but to stick for it for the moment, to create the suspense a little bit longer, it's kind of interesting to say that, I mean, we do live an extraordinary moment right now. When I started to be in the art world as a teenager, the art world still felt in Europe extremely closed. You had somehow a connection between Europe and the United States, and it was really only in the late 80s, early 90s that there started to be an opening towards a real polyphony of centers. And ever since, this polyphony has increased and increased and increased. We have many, many new art centers, and it's in this sense still early days of this process. And I think if one day we are going to look back to our time, and we will think what has really been the biggest change in our time, and that's a little bit the question of Fernand Braudel, of the long duration. What are the big patterns in the long duration? In the 16th century, things shifted from a Mediterranean paradigm to a more Atlantic paradigm. And we can say that maybe in the 21st century, we have a clear shift from a Western paradigm to an Eastern paradigm, because we have all these extraordinary art centers popping up in the East, in China, in India, in the Middle East.
North Africa.
Absolutely, North Africa. So I think that the answer is a very important role, an ever increasingly important role.
So back to our question. In 10 or 20 years, I mean, we have terms like Cubism and Orientalism and post-war and abstract expressionism and so on and so forth. What term do you think we can use to classify the revival of Middle Eastern art?
Yeah, that's, I mean, such a key question, no? Because it has obviously a lot to do with the artist being uncomfortable with this idea of, the Middle
labeling,
East.
yeah.
And thinking it is very much a concept, from a Western perspective. And I've never really met an artist who would be comfortable with this concept. Yeah, but we use it by default, no? And it's interesting, I mean, I've been organizing panels and discussions over the last couple of years. Actually, the first one had taken place here in Art Basel, when we were discussing the future of the museum in the Middle East.
That's right.
And there, I mean, a lot of the artists present really questioned it. They were saying we have a zone of, multipolarity. We have a situation of it was particularly Samir Amin who said that. It's a monde multipolaire. The proposal was made that we maybe could, talk about the southern hemisphere. But that obviously is a very large notion.
That's huge.
That is then even huge. And I think, one of the things which is important is, I mean, Benedict Anderson says nations are always imaginary categories because they're so huge, and continents are even bigger entities, and regions are even bigger entities. And one of the things, I mean, when we did Cities on the Move with Wuhan Ru, which was the big Asian project we did in the 90s, we tried to scale it down. We basically tried to say, let's look at cities. Mm-hmm. Let's look at let's look at Seoul, let's look at Tokyo, let's look at Shanghai, at Beijing, at Jakarta, mm-hmm. and let's have cities on the move as not sort of a gigantic identity construct, but let's have a polyphony of these different cities. And that obviously would still be the easiest thing how one could actually approach it. One could just scale it down by cities and could talk about these extraordinary new energies there are in Tehran, in Beirut, in the Gulf. And in these different, in Istanbul.
So it would be impossible to give it one term?
We still haven't given up, because I think, the best thing would be if it would come from the artists. I think, whenever, I mean, all the things you've mentioned, have mostly been artist-driven, denominators. And I mean, I was speaking this morning with Eyal Weizmann, who is one of the great thinkers, really, about this question, one of the great thinkers I know, in the world. And Eyal was saying, I mean, we have different possibilities. We can obviously talk about a very, very expanded field, and then, talk about a sort of an Islamic or pan-Islamic notion, and that then involves, according to him, everything, from Turkey to Iran, and is again a very, very big entity. Now many artists are not comfortable with that either, and that's why Eyal says, for him, maybe one possibility is that we sort of take a notion of the Arab 21st century, but define this in a very fluid way, no? And he was particularly mentioning that he's been writing lately and researching somehow Hariri's idea of a sort of a fluid Arabic notion, but that then obviously again excludes.
Exactly.
So in this sense, it's a conundrum. I think it's a very interesting process, and let's wait until an artist suddenly comes up with.
What are your future projects with regards to Middle Eastern art?
Yes, I mean, it's very much related to what I've just been mentioning, because the scaling, what do you do if you don't want to have any two big entities? You can go to cities, and you can do art from, Beirut, you can do art from Tehran, you can do art from these different cities. That's what we did with Cities on the Move. And when Julia Peyton-Jones and I, together with Sally Tennant and all our colleagues at the Serpentine, started to think what we could do, we actually thought it would be interesting to scale it even further down, and actually maybe bring it down to the level of a street. And we were particularly fascinated by the Edgware Road in London, because the Edgware Road is such an incredibly complex road, 5 minutes from the Serpentine, where there is such layers and layers of histories in relation to the Middle East. And we actually decided to not just do an exhibition, but as we always do, to do this as an evolutive, time-based thing. We've done this already with Indian Highway, our project. In terms of India, we connected this show and do connect it more and more, obviously, to the subcontinent, sort of to connect it to Pakistan, to Bangladesh, to Sri Lanka. The catalogue did this from the outset, and now also the exhibition. The Indian Highway is basically an exhibition which tours from city to city. Whenever it goes somewhere, we invite another artist to do an exhibition within the exhibition, so that basically our own exhibition is now the minority, and it's going to be a tiny minority in the future, because the show now goes to Sao Paulo, it will go to Moscow, it will go to 7, 8 more cities, and each time there is this additional new exhibition curated by an Indian curator or an Indian artist. So at the end, it's a true polyphony of these 12, 15 exhibitions. So that was the rule of the game. But actually with the Edgware Road, we decided again to make it a time-based process, because we think, particularly if all of a sudden an institution in the West, does an exhibition on Indian art or Middle Eastern art, very often this is also a form of, tokenism. It's just an exhibition is done and then the institution moves on. And for us, we decided with Julia that it's really a very serious long-term commitment over many years. And as we want this to be a serious long-term commitment, we are basically building up momentum with Edgware Road, which will then lead to a bigger exhibition. And for the moment, we have residencies. We thought it's a very important thing to also bring artists in residency from, and that's actually something we learned through the Indian Highway, because you learn always from the previous exhibitions and can then bring it into the next project. In the Indian Highway, a lot of artists are saying, in India, they've got these dozens of curators from all over the world who now come and do Indian show, and there is never any reciprocity. So what could be reciprocity? The notion of reciprocity became interesting. So we thought, by bringing artists, for the moment we have exchange with Cairo and Beirut, and we're hopefully going to have exchange with, several other cities, working with several, institutions there and advisors there. And the idea will be, and is that artists now spend several months in the Edgware Road, produce new work, and it's really, in this sense, a big work in progress. So that Serpentine Edgware Road, project is obviously our main project right now, and that will be over the next 18 months, 2 years. And then there are many book projects in relation to artists. I mean, I mentioned the book of Monir, and there are many more interviews with pioneers also planned, because I think what is interesting is that this whole generation of pioneers, I mean, Monir is still very active. Etel Adnan is an extraordinary pioneer, a poet and a visual artist between Beirut, San Francisco and Paris. The same thing is also true for Marwan, who is another great pioneer of the region. And to interview these artists and really also develop an oral history and an archive of oral history seems very important, because it's a protest against forgetting, but it's also a possibility to still experience this whole rich history firsthand, which I think is so key.
I'm going to ask you a series of tongue-in-cheek questions now. You founded the Brutal Morning Meetings, and you're known not to sleep at all. Do you dream?
Yeah, that's actually a very funny question, because when we did a book once with Francesco Bonami about dreams, so we gathered about 100 dreams, and Maurizio Cattelan sent in a dream that, because of not sleeping, not dreaming. But the thing is actually that as of the last couple of years, I started to sleep, so it's still, a very reduced amount of sleep. But so, I sleep, therefore I dream.
I see. And I know you read a lot. What book are you reading now? How many books a month do you read? And what kind of topics do they cover?
Yeah, I mean, I have a ritual. Tarkovsky once said that our time is a time where we have not many rituals anymore compared to previous moments, in time. And so I've believed always that we need to reintroduce in our daily life many rituals. And one of my many rituals is that I buy a book every day. I'm unbelievably unhappy if I don't buy at least one book every day. And so obviously, some of these books, I read them instantly, other, go into my archive. So I would say, maybe about 10 books a month I read. And at the moment, my main reading remains Édouard Glissant. I think Édouard Glissant is the most important philosopher, poet, and thinker of the early 21st century. I think he is to our time what Foucault or Deleuze were to a previous time, and particularly at the moment when we've got in every young artist studio a Badiou book and a Rancière book. I think it's interesting to introduce a bit more diversity into the reading and encourage everybody really to read Édouard Glissant, because Glissant is so interesting in relation to globalization. He's so interesting in relation to multipolarity. He's so interesting in relation to this whole shift of centers. I mean, all the things we've been discussing today are kind of Édouard Glissant topics. So what I'm reading right now is an anthology he has done of poetry. So he's brought together poetry which has been influential to him throughout history. I mean, from Apollinaire to, younger poets working now. And it's very much a curatorial project, because it creates a lot of, connections, unexpected junctions between these different poems, which, great curating always does. Great curating always creates junctions which otherwise you couldn't have imagined there to be.
On the subject of connections, I think, well, what could the person who stole your BlackBerry do with its contents and all the connections you have in there?
Yeah, I mean, the BlackBerry was actually stolen. It was a very interesting moment a couple of years ago. I was with Cedric Price, the late Cedric Price, the great architect. We were walking in the street, and a motorcycle approached us from behind and fished the phone whilst I spoke. So that was a kind of a very weird way of using the BlackBerry. But otherwise, I've never really,
What's inside it other than contacts and...
Sorry?
What's inside it other than contacts?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously
notes.
all the notes. There is, the documents. I record an interview almost every day. So there is about 2,000 hours of, there's about 2,000 hours of interview. But most of them are on the laptop. They're not in the BlackBerry.
So the person could actually publish a book, an anthology on your life through your BlackBerry.
Yes, I suppose the BlackBerry and the laptop together are kind of, you know, infolded monsters where everything is inside.
Okay,
yeah.
Speaking of your life, who would you think should play you in a movie of your life? An actor or multiple actors?
No, I've never thought about that, but I have a favorite actor who is Melville Poupeau. I think he's an extraordinary actor. He's friends with many artists. He played these fabulous roles with Jean Moreau. He's one of the great young French actors, Melville Poupeau.
And finally, who do you think has a tougher life, the curator or the artist?
Both and instead of either or, instead of no, or it's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. As
Okay.
Rosemary Trockel once quoted in one of her famous works.
I just want to close this session with something that Hans and I this morning were discussing. It's a quote by a German author, Hans Magnus Enzensberger, who said, "Culture is a little like dropping an Alka-Seltzer into a glass. You don't see it, but somehow it does something." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, if there are urgent questions, there is a question. Yeah.
Hi. I come from Iran, but I'm asking this question not as someone from the Middle East, but just because of being from that region. I have gone through an experience. And there has been a lot of attention to Middle Eastern art recently, or art from countries in the Middle East. But until now, it has been very much pushed to the periphery. And now that there is a revival, it is still expected that it is presented in a certain form that conforms to the Western aesthetics. And in that way, it doesn't actually add to the archive or to the categorization that you have already in Western art. How would you open that platform to include, to be really inclusive, not only in content, not only in things that Middle Eastern artists or artists from that region are tackling as subjects, but in form, which is much more important for me in opening up new categories for it.
Yeah, I think there are many ways to address this. I mean, one way is obviously, what I mentioned before, that if, for example, I would speak to Suzanne Hefuna, and Suzanne Hefuna, as a, younger artist who is working now, between Egypt and Germany, she says, her hero is Monir in Iran, that is a very important reference. So the idea, that there is a context. You do not just all of a sudden have, all these young artists, but you give a history and a context of what actually has influenced these artists, which are not Western influences necessarily, but actually can be influences, from, the region, or what we used to call the Middle East and are now in search for a neologism, to replace it. And I think what is interesting is, obviously, that can happen in the West, as it can also happen, in these different cities, which are all now going to have new museums, because obviously these new museums, are not necessarily going to replicate the Western museum. And I think the big danger there is that, museums are replicated, all over the world, and that we do not necessarily enough question that different places would actually need different museums, and that the museum today in Cairo could be a very different museum from a museum in Tehran, could be a very, very different museum, from a museum in the Gulf, could be a very, very different museum from a museum in London. So this idea that it's not homogeneous, and that's why Glissant is so important. So I really think that, the reading of Edouard Glissant is a daily toolbox towards what you address. And he has invented this fascinating museum for Martinique, which is really a great study model for a non-Western arts organization with all its ramifications, and you know, so I think that's is a model, maybe, you know, how it could work, and how different histories could be written.
Any other questions? All right, just want to tell everybody that Gender Wars and Tudors, the official transcripts, will be published into a book inclusive of this panel discussion, and the book will be out in October. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.